Welcome to the Sales Compensation Show, where we share the latest sales performance insights through in-depth discussion with experts. Season 3 of our show is your backstage pass to discovering how today's most successful sales and revenue ops teams support go-to-market strategy and improve sales performance. Plus, we'll explore what we can learn about incentives from different industries more broadly. Subscribe to hear how leaders are unlocking new growth, implementing the latest compensation trends, and their priorities for improving go-to-market performance. I'm your host, CEO of Forma.ai, Nabeil Alazzam. Hi, Edie. It's great to have you on the show today, and thank you for joining.
Hi, Nabeil. Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, we'd love to have you share with the audience how you got into this career.
Yeah, absolutely. I did not know anything about this space when I was younger. I actually started my career in software development. So I was actually in R&D here at SAS and started there and then transitioned into some more technology development with our internally built CRM system. So I spent about 16 years of my career doing software development of CRM systems, learning about the business and how the sales teams operate and work, and ultimately ended up taking an opportunity to transition to the business side by leading our global sales operations team, global sales incentive team, and been here ever since. I love it. It's fast-paced, it's challenging, there's a new issue to address every single day, so it keeps me on my toes.
That transition, I've seen before in terms of like the technical path that leads into, it kind of aligns very well with the skill sets required in sales ops and revenue operations of like, you need to be technical, you need to be problem solver, you need to be empathetic and kind of a client facer and stakeholder and project manager, all while being a very large people like leader. But it's very interesting in your case, you had that scale up and that growth from a career perspective within the same company that you still work at today. And so like you're intimately aware of the products that the sales team delivers and sells, so I'm curious how that has impacted your career and your experience.
Oh, that's very interesting. And just to add to that, my husband is still in R&D here at SAS, so I have continued to learn about what our products are and how we're taking those to market. It's been very helpful to have that well-rounded approach to leading this organization. I think it provides line of sight not only to what we want our sales teams to do and how we want them to go to market, but it also provides the technical background to support the revenue technology that my team supports for the front line. It's an interesting mix of skill sets for sure. It's pretty unique, I think, from software development into VP of RevOps, but I love it. It ended up being exactly where I needed to be.
I mean, yeah, within RevOps, so much of it is about data and systems and interconnectability. And I think, yeah, it certainly gives you a very unique perspective. And then I imagine the shift over to the business side, having been at SAS and knowing the products probably made it easier of a shift. I think, yeah, it could be, it's very, very powerful when you have all the context of the business and the products as you're kind of serving the sales organization or the business side.
Yeah, I think what really helped was being on the CRM, the internally built CRM. I guess one of the advantages of having that internally built CRM is it's customized to how the business actually runs. We were consistently engaging with the business teams to understand how they go to market, how they sell, what things from the technology and the CRM will support them. So I learned a lot about the business side of things while I was doing the technology. So having that to kind of transition into completely in the business side of things was very helpful.
The RevOps org, you sit across all these different, stakeholders, systems, data. Like, what was the biggest surprise in making that career shift? What was the thing that you didn't expect when you landed in the seat?
The biggest thing is just how hard it is to implement a change. We make strategic decisions and we change directions as a company, and all of the operational work that goes into making that come to fruition is pretty significant. And I think you don't really know that until you're actually in the weeds, if you will, and actually making it happen. So yeah. Change is quite underestimated, I think, sometimes when you look at it from outside of an operations organization.
I mean, especially because like the changes you're making are, and I always say it's like all rivers flow into comp or impacting the performance outcomes of a seller. And so, any change you make, whether it's segmentation or, the way you map customers, the way you compensate someone, measure them on performance. I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of this like human fuzziness of like you're changing either someone's pay or how they go about doing specific activities to get to their pay. And humans are, it's difficult changing anything in that mindset. So like in engineering, it's pretty much is this logical? And then you ship the code, it gets peer reviewed, et cetera, versus there's a bit more of the kind of selling, I imagine.
The unintended behavioral impacts, sometimes when you think you've laid out the best possible spiff and it doesn't land well, because the behavior that it caused was not exactly what you expected, it's somewhat surprising. So I think, sometimes we can't always predict what that behavior is going to be when we implement a compensation strategy.
100%. And I feel like you're always trying to outgame the gamers, right? In the sense of like, okay, yeah, when the desired outcome is achieved, when the sellers game the plan is like perfect, but it's difficult to think of every possible outcome of how they could do that. So
Yes,
it's
I'm always surprised at how many tricks are played in order to optimize the compensation, things that you would just never imagine.
yeah. It's yeah, we've seen our fair share, and I it always amazes me because sometimes I'm like, these sellers, and there's actually a very strong overlap with some of the best sellers, like being the best at navigating and building out their like account maps and like their strategy for the year based off of the incentives, the coverage models that you deploy. So it's, you almost want to bring them in as a part of this change. And so on that note, I guess like when you're thinking about, because I imagine at the scale of SaaS and like where you sit across the entire revenue like operations organization, when you think about the large scale transformations that you've done, I guess like what would you say is the hardest part at that scale? Like not just any single change, but like wholesale, large transformations that I imagine you've undergone.
Funny enough, that question is really relevant to us right now. We've just gone through some significant go-to-market changes in our structure and strategy. So we are in the middle of massive change right now. To be honest, I think the biggest challenge that we face with all of this change is change fatigue. I feel like, when you're changing a lot of different things at the same time, people underestimate what that does to the people absorbing the changes. We could have leadership changes, we could have strategy changes, compensation strategy changes all at once, trying to enable, educate, and support so people understand how they move forward and are successful with all of this change. They just get tired and therefore they don't absorb as much information as you'd expect them to. We also sometimes run into issues with we're going through a lot of changes, just everybody wanting that last little tweak. When we get kind of towards the end of the change, oh, but maybe we should just tweak this one thing. And as a revenue operations team, sometimes, we have to kind of say, sorry, no more changes, even though we feel like some of the changes that come at us are valuable and should be implemented. But if we don't necessarily kind of stop it, then we'll never progress. And that kind of sometimes weighs pretty heavily on us emotionally, with the change fatigue plus having to say no to great ideas that sometimes are coming up just so we can progress forward. I think that's pretty impactful.
The change fatigue is real, and I think you see it where with large changes, what I've seen is sellers start to question things that are not even like changing, and that's when you're like it's a problem because the sales team is so unsure about everything that even if it's not been communicated as a part of a change, they're questioning the validity of those existing rules, and so the amount of time and effort and frankly cost, both in lack of sales productivity or the loss of sales productivity and the cost to you and the team answering those questions and doing the change requirements is pretty heavy.
Yes, absolutely. We've been hosting like live Q&A sessions so we can make sure everybody has their questions answered and try to eliminate that, what if or those questions about the unknowns that people might have. That's heavy. That's resource intensive, that's time intensive. And then you also understand some of the things that you didn't expect might be the consequence of the change. And then you have to address those as well. So it has its pluses and minuses, I'd say, but it is massive change is really fatiguing and emotionally draining.
Yeah, 100%. And the problem is it's unavoidable, right? Like your organization has to evolve to the market. And
Right.
I always think about this like in go to market, the best go-to-market teams are not just the fastest to react, they're the ones that can kind of define what good looks like during a kind of a transition period because you're at the forefront of defining the customer experience amongst your competitors and kind of be the one to lead what good looks like. And to do that, you have to move fast, but it comes at a price of like everything else that comes with it. I guess, is there anything you do to prepare for upcoming future changes or the potential of change that may come up that makes it easier?
We try to, quite often we can kind of see how things are progressing and kind of be part of that change. Occasionally we get hit by a curveball and it's a strategic corporate change that we weren't anticipating. And how we go about addressing those two things are different, right? Things that we can kind of progressively plan towards, we have kind of a better approach because we feel more grounded in it. Things that are kind of a curveball, you have to find that footing first. So you make sure you understand what the change is actually going to be and how it will transition throughout the organization. And then you can implement. So it takes a little while to kind of get, your foundation in that change when you get thrown a curveball. So I think it depends on the situation, Nabeil. I think we have to deal with what we've been given. Sometimes we do great. And sometimes, we're just taking it day by day.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. I mean, yeah, and sometimes those curveballs, the faster you react, even though it's chaotic, it's really good for the business. And other times, I think organizations move too fast. And to your point, like you may be better off like planning it out well in advance and actually having kind of like a narrative to the change that's easily understood and kind of adopted by sellers. And I think like the speed of the transformation is probably a pretty big part of it. So I guess I'm curious, like how do you define that or work with the stakeholders that you have to engage with to kind of set those limits and define kind of the project plan for a large transformation like that?
That's a really good question. I think it depends on if it's the curveball or if it's the one that we've been able to proactively strategize for. With a proactive strategy, we can pretty much define exactly when we can deliver, and we're probably, a percentage of the way there before it even gets decided because we've been proactively planning. The curveball is a little different. Usually, when we get thrown a curveball, we're also given a date. So it's a little bit different in that we have to say, we're going to do this by this date. And then we have to figure out what we can actually accomplish along the way and then what the trade-offs are in order to be able to accomplish that date. And I think, back to your earlier point, when you get thrown the curveballs, those are the ones that have immediate impact. If we can show that we can accommodate the curveballs and see the positive impact, I think that builds trust within the organization. So when the next curveball comes along, then they kind of get on the change train a little bit faster, right? They can accept it a little bit more because they can trust that it will have a positive outcome.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like the advocacy that you have from the sales organization, if they trust you, it's like a tailwind versus a very strong headwind.
Yes,
Yeah.
completely agree.
So like to double click on a little bit on that influence that you need to build up, I guess like what do you think is something that RevOps gets wrong about influence within an organization?
That's a really great question. I think sometimes RevOps relies too strongly on data and analytics. And I think when we're talking with the field and we're trying to implement new strategy, we have to make sure that we understand their perspective. So I think we can come to the table with all the data and analytics that we'd like to, but I think that's only part of the story. I think we always need to understand that our influence is not just in the data and the analytics, but it's in our understanding of how the field operates and the input from the field. So I think there has to be some really great marrying of data and art, so science and art, in order to effectively create the influence that a RevOps organization wants to create. And I think, back to what we were talking about earlier, trust is so key. Like we have to, as a RevOps organization, build and establish the trust with the front line so they understand that we're working with them and not just trying to optimize for other reasons. We want them to see that we're partners on the road to success. And I think, that comes with that relationship building and that relational intelligence that you have to build in order to establish the trust. So to answer your question, RevOps influence is not just based, in my opinion, on data and analytics. It is that relational bit as well that's so key.
Yeah, I mean, you could be fully data driven. The problem is what organization today fully has every last bit of data that you need on sales, right? And I think like and maybe there's a philosophical debate of like, is sales art or is it science? And I would argue that, it could be science, purely 100% science. The problem is that we don't have the data. We don't really capture a sales process perfectly in the sense of like all the activities that are done. And it's those little nuances that sellers do that are really impactful sometimes, but we just don't know because we're not capturing every last little piece. And so
Right.
if you don't have the feelers in the field and the relationships with those leaders to bring that kind of qualitative data back in, it's very hard for you to feel confident, I imagine, in any recommendation or rollout that you have. I mean, I think there's an interesting piece, and I know that you mentioned this around like the governance, like being like where to draw the line firmly, and kind of like governance things like that, versus where do you have a little bit more wiggle room, and those things can erode trust if you're not very clear with where the limits are. So I'm curious how you think about approaching that nuance.
We have to have both, right? We have to have a backbone or a strong, firm stance on things like governance to make sure that we don't have people taking advantage of like our compensation strategy, for instance. But we have to have some empathy to make sure that we understand how the business is running and get their point of view. It's a difficult balance sometimes to make sure that we balance both the empathy and the backbone. But I think both of those contribute to building the trust that we need to move the organization forward. I think an effective leader will be able to do both, be able to have that strong governance and be firm when decisions are clear. And then when we need to have that art, if you will, of the selling motion in play, then to be able to understand and consider that as well.
Do you have an example where, or have you seen this in practice where there's something that you're very firm on from a governance perspective, but in the relationships that you've built in that empathy, there's been enough examples that force you or not force you, but at least guide you to kind of rethink that line in the sand, that governance piece?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you an example. We have a internal policy when we transition accounts from one AE to the other. For example, if there's an open territory or an AE leaves because and has an opportunity that's, I don't know, halfway through the deal cycle, we have a policy that will require us to reevaluate the target of the AE that's accepting the account, whether that target needs to be increased or decreased. And we have found that in most instances that makes sense, but there are occasions in which we need to consider the circumstances of that transition. So it could be economic circumstances of the AE's environment in which they are trying to sell into. That might mean that, the target increase shouldn't occur. Or other uncontrollable factors of the AE that may need to be considered. So that's a great example of where you have to stand firm to make sure you have a policy that's in place to make sure everybody's treated fairly. But you have to consider that there are odd occasions in which you might need to be a little bit more empathetic to the situation.
It's like the framework is pretty structurally defined, but there are like release valves or from maybe an engineering perspective, like injection points
Yeah.
to your pipeline to basically bring in that qualitative data or modifiers to the framework. I mean, I guess that's a very common one, and it's tough because again, the variables, the data could be there, right? Like you could understand historical sales in an account, what's already occurred, the potential, how long the sales cycle on average for that segment and that type of customer is, but rarely is that data accessible enough or available in a structured enough way where you can truly just like have a perfectly calculated quote adjustment be designed.
Right.
And this is
Right.
where I think leaning on the sales managers or the sales leaders to kind of help support that qualitative side. There's a balance, right? Because you want that qualitative feedback, but to your point earlier on like the gaming and the optimization, maybe for not the right outcomes for the business, or if you think about like kind of balancing, how do you manage and kind of or control how the qualitative inputs are gathered and done in a way that is both optimal for equity and the business outcomes?
Yeah, it's like I said, it's kind of a tough balance.
Yeah.
But I think, we have standard processes in place that will allow the qualitative feedback to feedback through our operations team from the sales organization. And then our operations team and our compensation team meet routinely to review those things. Sometimes it's super clear cut, like it's clear cut that the policy has to remain in place, that there's no exception. And in some instances, it takes a couple of rounds of discussion, and sometimes we have to take it even up the sales chain. Sometimes we get all the way up to the CSO that has to make that decision or help us kind of come to an agreement on what needs to be done. So in our organization, we just have that very structured workflow on how the decisions can escalate. And that helps us kind of balance between, policy versus exception.
Yeah, if you don't have that governance structure in place and the kind of escalation path, it's very easy for sales leaders to do, as long as it doesn't impact them. Like whatever's better for their sellers is actually probably better for them in the long term if it doesn't impact their own numbers.
Right.
It's this balance, but which again, I mean, like as a good leader, you want them fighting for their team and kind of like enabling them to have the best chance. But there's only so much to go around, right? And I
Yeah,
think
exactly.
that's the other side of the equation that we have to balance for. So, curious from a compensation perspective, obviously, as within RevOps, you touch and manage and see and set comp, both the structure and design for the sales organization. And so I'm curious what controversial opinion or, frankly, a contrarian opinion you have on incentive design.
So I think as sales compensation designers, plan administrators, we often get approached for a compensation strategy for everything under the sun. It could be, new product coming to market. It could be, a new behavior that we want to entice within a specific organization. My controversial opinion is that incentives won't fix a broken strategy. So if you're bringing a new product to market and you don't have a strategy behind that, an incentive might help support selling that initially, but it's just going to fizzle out pretty quickly if the strategy is not there. Yeah. Same thing for pricing or, the go-to-market structure. If we're not structured to sell the new product appropriately, compensation is not going to solve that for us. It's very important before we establish a new compensation strategy to fully understand the corporate strategy or the enterprise strategy for how we want to take a product to market and make sure that we understand the behaviors that we want to instill in our teams. It's not only a controversial opinion of mine, it's one of my pet peeves is that everybody says compensation is going to fix this. And it's not a compensation tool. I mean, compensation is not a tool that can fix every strategy problem that we have.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's like you can pay $1 million to make something happen, but if it's just not if it's not possible, then it doesn't really matter. No one's gonna go after it. I mean, this is where it's like this concept of like it's effort adjusted comp, maybe. Like, what is from a seller's perspective or a plan participant's perspective, like what is the amount of effort they would have to put in for every dollar that they're gonna get out? And if you actually think about the landscape of how incentives optimize, it's like you want an incentive that is like maximizing that ratio is actually what's going to truly motivate a seller to change a behavior or change a desired outcome.
Right.
But if the behavior that you're trying to motivate is just not going to fix that product market fit problem or fix that, product, support or sales motion problem, the effort's too high. It's just not worth it. They're going to go focus on somewhere else. And that part is difficult because it's not just in the control. It's way beyond the control of the comp plan, right? It's selling motion, product. So I guess like when you do get asked for this, and this is like I would say, fortunately, it's a very common theme because again, money in the minds of everyone is like, oh, that fixes a lot of problems. So let's just go to the very end and solve it when really there's a bunch of inputs to that. But I guess like how do you manage the stakeholders internally to guide the right conversation or at least like highlight the problem area?
My approach to this has changed in the years that I've been over compensation. At first, when I first started getting approached for these things, I would scramble to try to find a compensation solution. Now I push back pretty hard. I'm not going to develop a compensation solution until I understand the strategy. Like, where are we going to sell this? Who is going to sell this? What's the revenue expectation? And then I try to figure out what the compensation strategy will be. So that's just kind of something I've learned through experience. And I think now we're at a point where people are hearing me and we're doing better about building the strategy before we just tack a compensation measure onto an activity.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, because otherwise it's band-aids on
Yeah.
on a very much bigger wound.
And we've seen that. We've tacked a compensation strategy on something that had no, go-to-market strategy, and it tanked. So, we sold a handful, but it wasn't what we needed to do. That wasn't a compensation problem. That was a problem with making sure that the product fit the market and that we had the right sellers selling it and that we had the right motion to sell it. So, the proof is in what we have done, I think. And I think now people are better at understanding of why I'm asking for that, right? Asking for the strategy and making sure that we have all of that planned out before we put a compensation measure on top. And that too is working, right? We're seeing that now that we have the strategy in place, we will see, or we are seeing, effective compensation usage to drive the penetration in the market.
Yeah, I mean, it's pushing back in those cases, at least to understand the why and the purpose behind what you're looking to drive and how it aligns that strategy is so important because like the pushing to get those answers will fast cycle through like the issue of like rolling out a comp plan, not seeing the results, and then having to do that. But it's difficult because you have to have the trust of the sales organization to be able to take that feedback and run through it. And this is what makes, I think, RevOps and RevOps, sales ops, like and sales comp, depending on how the organization is set up, so difficult because you have all these stakeholders. Everyone has kind of a sliver into this, and you have to go back and push on something that they just see as like, okay, there's a solution here.
Yeah,
go do
exactly.
That. I'm curious, just to kind of shift a little bit over to more of the fun segment here on the show. I think would it be possible for you to share like a real life experience that shaped your point of view on, I would say like incentives, but within planning, RevOps, and or leadership?
My segment or my answer to this is really going to be about leadership and how I strongly believe in collaborative leadership across operations and sales compensation in general. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background and a story. So when I first started in compensation, mid 2017-ish, our company operated with decentralized sales incentive plans. So we're a global company. We have many offices around the world, and in each country or region, the sales leader of that region or country developed the compensation strategy. So what we were seeing at that time is the different leaders were incenting different things. Some might be incenting a specific product, some may be focusing on new revenue, while others might be focusing on renewals. And the CSO at the time recognized this and went to all of us and tried to pull it all together to a global strategy. So we were able to get to a singular global incentive strategy in 2019, and we kind of built out the global sales incentive team. So we had all plans administered centrally. They were all similar metrics and measures. They were all focused the behavior in the same direction. However, at that point in time, the decision authority on compensation still resided with the CSO. The CSO ultimately changed, and at that point in time, we swung the pendulum completely to the opposite direction, and we put global sales incentive compensation under finance. And then when we did that, compensation turned out to be more of a cost containment measure rather than, an incentive measure. So it went from really trying to appease the sales leadership to really trying to cost cut on compensation. So we saw a lot of, behavioral impacts. We saw a lot of disengagement. And during that time, we kind of built up a stronger relationship with HR. Folks were coming to HR with some concerns about the compensation strategy. And that allowed us to have a better, engagement with the HR side of the house. Ultimately, where we've landed on global incentive compensation is we are reporting up into the COO. And we have a compensation committee, if you will, that has representation, the CFO, the CHRO, the CSO, the COO are all working together on the compensation strategy. And we are actually building some of the best compensation strategy that I've seen in my tenure here in the compensation incentive world. And I think what I've learned from this is really there's so many perspectives across the company with our leadership that to get us all on the same page and marching to the same beat is super important to drive that overall corporate strategy. And sales incentive kind of builds that up, right? We kind of drive what the company will be selling, and we kind of help support, the success of the entire company. So I think it's super important for us as a leadership team to work collaboratively across the organizations instead of in silos. So that's my real world example of how collaborative leadership really has benefited us.
It's a common example and it's a common theme that I see where, like, depending on where it sits, it looks very different, especially if it's isolated. Like, this is your opportunity. And I think incentives are very interesting. It's like, it is the opportunity of bridging all of the pieces of the business together into executing on kind of a very aligned to the business strategy outcome. And so, and I find that there are some organizations where it sits within a specific department, but the organization goes through the effort of consolidating the strategy at the
Yeah.
top, and then they disseminate that to the rest. And if that's very well done, then sometimes you can get away from like the fact that it's siloed, yes, but really it's not that siloed because the strategy is kind of disseminated throughout the organization very proactively. But if the effort is not done to do that, then you have to like bring all the stakeholders together and have the real conversations around like, look, if we drive this, if we move this lever, we're going to lose this. Like, you decide, right, as a leadership team, where is the trade-off that you're comfortable with? And ultimately, it's very hard to do. If even in the best organizations, I mean, that's kind of the art and the art part of the art and science of incentives.
I'm super excited. I feel like we have reached a point where we are truly leveraging everybody's input on the compensation strategy, and I am confident it's going to be a great year for us from a compensation point of view. So we've had that story spanned about 10 years, but we've had multiple leadership changes since then. We have a amazing leadership team in place right now, and I feel super confident we're on the right path.
It's hard to get right, but when you get the structure right and you have it flowing, like the impact of the business can be tremendous. And interesting with like the swing of like bringing in the decentralized like global model and bringing that, it's a very heavy lift, but it is also powerful because it enables you, I imagine, the agility that you have now to be able to kind of like quickly pivot a global organization because everything is kind of rolling up into one. You have visibility into everything. It's, painful, but it's well worth going through the exercise of doing. I guess question for you on like how maybe like any feedback or learnings for others that are kind of going through that exercise right now on how to watch outs or things to do when you're kind of bringing that consolidation into a centralized model?
Yeah, well, it's not easy, especially, as diverse as ours was across so many different countries. The biggest learning for me when we tried to consolidate all of that is that culture makes a difference. And I think what you see culturally in the US or Canada, for example, is completely different than culturally what you might see in Asia Pacific or even some countries in EMEA. And I think as you're building the global plan, the global strategy, you have to keep in mind the different cultures that might be included in that strategy and be aware of the impacts of that culture to the strategy. So, to give you an example, if you will, many countries in AP are very hierarchical, right? And so, when a salesperson needs a decision made, they're going to look above the chain, right, above that person in the chain. Whereas in America, they might make the decision on their own. And we have to make sure that we drive that global consistency across the cultural impacts, not just in compensation, but in day-to-day operational processes, deal approvals, trying to make sure the deal structures are the same, et cetera. So culture is a big impact lever, I think. You have some cultures in EMEA that take a significant amount of the summer off, right? How does that impact your targeting and your compensation strategy within that region in a global, incentive plan? So my advice would just be considerate of the culture because it makes a big difference. It could
Yeah.
impact the plan.
You almost need to design that variance within the global frameworks that you roll out. Like the goal isn't again to when you're consolidating and kind of centralizing things, it's not to remove the flexibility. It's to just, have a single point that defines best practice and what is important to the business and then disseminate that with all the various cultures. which again is hard to do because you open it up too much and then now you're back to the same position.
Yeah.
Everyone's unique. But it's like, where are those release valves that you absolutely need because of the uniqueness across
Yes,
the organization?
absolutely.
I always wrap up the show with two questions, and kick off with the first one here. Is there any resource, podcast, book that you have found relevant to your career growth, and especially again after like the migration and shift over, that has been tremendously helpful that you want to share with the audience?
Yes, and it kind of goes back to the comment we just made. So one of my favorite books from a global leadership perspective is The Culture Map. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the author off the top of my head, but it actually kind of teaches you how to map out how to work with a globally diverse team, understanding what's important in each different culture, where you might not think something is very important, but another culture might, and how you cross those divides. I love that book, and I recommend it to everybody that I know is going into a global leadership position.
That's a great example. It's very, very tactical and like very useful in the world of sales comp. So yeah, no,
Yeah.
I appreciate that's a great example. And then second question, is there anyone in this space that you'd like to take out to lunch, to pick their brain, get their feedback?
Yes, I would love to take David Ciccelli out for lunch and just pick his brain. So, yes.
An icon in the industry, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, Edie, for joining and the wonderful discussion today. I think, as I've shared in the past, when I first started my career in the space, there's literally like almost no community. It was very hard to actually get information and real life examples unless you actively worked with someone, on a project or knew them from previous co-working, et cetera. But it's been amazing to kind of see what we've been able to build up and kind of the thought leadership we've been able to put out. But none of it would be possible without leaders like you taking the time out of the day to come in and share your experience. So I just want to thank you again. I think some great tidbits for especially for those that are just entering a very global leadership position like you're in today. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for what you're doing. I think this is amazing because it's the same thing for me. When I first started in the compensation world, there wasn't a lot of people, a lot of content or, many people to refer to and ask questions about it. So I think what you're doing, building this community is fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And yeah, I feel like it's been, it's crazy, like time, like just last 10 years to now, it's very, very different, but it's so nuanced. Like you can't just go search, how do I solve this specific problem? It's like, there's so many nuances and
Right.
edge cases that like, unless you can actually, reach out and, get someone's input on something and that's already done it before, it's very difficult. And so, but yeah, no, thank you again for joining and, yeah, looking forward to seeing you in the next Sales Config Tank session. But yeah,
Awesome. Sounds
absolutely.
great. All right. Thanks so much, Nabeil.
The Sales Compensation Show is brought to you by Forma.ai, the sales performance management platform that fully integrates sales planning with rapid, scalable incentive compensation management. Our data platform brings together how you can plan and manage the entire lifecycle of territories, quotas, and incentives. With global customers like Autodesk, Stryker, and Hootsuite, we enable go-to-market teams to plan and deploy even the most complex SPM strategies at speed, taking you from idea to execution instantly. To learn more about Forma.ai, visit our website at Forma.ai. Hit the subscribe button and find more episodes of the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in.